The darkness over the eastern front was absolute until a soft whistling sound broke the silence of the night. German soldiers stationed in the trenches froze as they recognized the terrifying noise of wind rushing over canvas wings. Above them, invisible in the ink-black sky, a biplane glided with its engine cut to absolute silence. The wooden aircraft drifted like a phantom predator, stalking its prey in the dead of night. Suddenly, a loud explosion shattered the stillness as a bomb struck the ammunition depot below, sending shockwaves through the camp. Chaos erupted on the ground as searchlights swept the clouds in a frantic attempt to locate the unseen attacker. This was the silent terror brought by the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. These raids happened night after night, leaving the German troops exhausted and paranoid. The pilots responsible for this psychological warfare were unlike any the Germans had faced before. They were not hardened male veterans of the Luftwaffe or the Royal Air Force. They were young women from the Soviet Union, flying obsolete crop dusters made of plywood and canvas. The German soldiers coined a specific name for these relentless aviators who struck from the shadows. They called them the Nachthexen, or the Night Witches. The sound of their gliding planes reminded the soldiers of a witch sweeping across the sky on a broomstick. It was a name meant to mock, but it soon became a title of immense fear and respect. To understand how these women ended up in the cockpits of bombers, we must look back to the desperate summer of 1941. The German war machine had launched Operation Barbarossa and was tearing through the Soviet Union with terrifying speed. The Red Army was suffering catastrophic losses, and the Luftwaffe dominated the skies. The existence of the Soviet state hung by a thread as the invaders pushed closer to Moscow. In this hour of existential dread, every resource was needed to halt the fascist advance. While millions of men were conscripted to the front lines, thousands of Soviet women also clamored for the chance to fight for their homeland. Among those demanding a role in combat was Major Marina Raskova. She was already a national celebrity and a hero of the Soviet Union, known for her record-breaking long-distance flights. Marina Raskova was the Soviet equivalent of Amelia Earhart and possessed immense influence within the military hierarchy. She received sacks of mail from young women across the country who wanted to fly in defense of their nation. These women were tired of digging anti-tank trenches or serving as nurses. They wanted to pilot fighters and bombers. Raskova realized that this untapped reservoir of patriotic fervor could be a decisive weapon in the war effort. Marina Raskova took her bold proposal directly to Joseph Stalin. She argued that Soviet women were already flying in civil aviation and were ready to serve in combat roles. It was a radical idea for the time, as no country had ever allowed women to fly combat missions on such a scale. However, the desperate situation on the front lines required desperate measures. Stalin listened to the famous aviatrix and granted his approval. On October 8, 1941, Order Number 0099 was issued. It authorized the formation of 3 female aviation regiments. Raskova immediately set out to recruit the best female pilots the Soviet Union had to offer. The response to the recruitment call was overwhelming, as thousands of young women volunteered. Many were students or factory workers, while others were instructors from local flying clubs. They were barely out of their teens, yet they possessed a fierce determination to defeat the German invaders. Marina Raskova personally interviewed the candidates, selecting only the most skilled and disciplined applicants. These women were leaving behind their families and their education to enter a brutal conflict. They knew the risks, but their patriotism outweighed their fear. They boarded trains and headed east away from the advancing front to begin their transformation into soldiers. The destination for the new recruits was the Angels Military Aviation School on the Volga River. When they arrived, they were met with a harsh reality. The military infrastructure was not prepared for women. There were no uniforms designed for the female form, so they were issued ill-fitting male clothing. The flight suits were too large, and the boots were often several sizes too big, requiring them to stuff the toes with rags. Despite these indignities, the women did not complain. They altered their uniforms as best they could and focused on the task at hand. They had to master military navigation and bombing tactics in a fraction of the normal training time. The training regimen at Angels was grueling and intense. The women were expected to learn in a few months what usually took years of practice. They studied mechanics and ballistics for 14 hours a day. They practiced night flying and formation tactics until they were exhausted. Marina Raskova held them to an incredibly high standard, knowing that any failure would be used to discredit the idea of female combat pilots. The cold winter winds of the Volga steppe added to their misery, but it also hardened their resolve. They forged a deep bond of sisterhood that would sustain them through the horrors of the coming battles. From this intensive training program, 3 distinct regiments were formed. The 586th Fighter Aviation Regiment and the 587th Bomber Aviation Regiment were equipped with modern aircraft. However, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment was given a very different machine. This unit, which would become the most famous of the 3, was strictly female from the pilots to the mechanics. They were placed under the command of Major Yevdokia Bershinskaya, a strict but capable leader. The women of the 588th were assigned the Polikarpov Po-2. It was a crushing disappointment for many who had dreamed of flying fast fighter jets. The Polikarpov Po-2 was a primitive biplane designed in the late 1920s. It was originally intended for use as a crop duster and a training aircraft. The plane was constructed almost entirely of wood and canvas held together by wire and glue. It had an open cockpit that offered zero protection from the elements or enemy fire. The top speed of the Po-2 was only about 90 miles per hour, which was slower than the stall speed of most German fighters. This meant that if a German Messerschmitt tried to slow down enough to shoot it down, the fighter would likely stall and crash. Despite its obsolescence, the Polikarpov Po-2 had certain advantages that the women learned to exploit. It was incredibly maneuverable and could fly at treetop level. It could take off and land on short makeshift runways, which allowed the regiment to operate close to the front lines. However, the plane had no radio and no armor plating. The pilots had to rely on hand signals and flashlights to communicate. The canvas skin of the aircraft was highly flammable, and a single tracer bullet could turn the plane into a ball of fire. It was a fragile chariot for such a dangerous mission. In May 1942, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment was deployed to the Southern Front. The arrival of an all-female unit was met with skepticism and laughter by their male counterparts. The men mocked their oversized boots and their wooden planes, calling them the Duncan Regiment. The women ignored the ridicule and prepared for their first combat sorties. They were determined to prove their worth in blood and fire. Their mission was to harass the German rear lines, destroying depots and bridges while preventing the enemy from sleeping. The stage was set for their legendary campaign. The first missions were fraught with danger and technical difficulties. The women flew in the pitch-black night with only basic instruments to guide them. They had to navigate over complex terrain and locate well-camouflaged targets. The German anti-aircraft defenses were formidable, and the sky would light up with tracers and explosions. On their very first night, the regiment lost a plane and its crew. It was a tragic awakening to the brutality of war. Yet the survivors did not falter. They climbed back into their cockpits the next night and the night after that. The pilots of the 588th soon developed their signature tactic that earned them their terrifying nickname. As they approached the target area, the pilots would cut their engines to idle. This eliminated the noise of the motor, allowing the biplane to glide silently toward the enemy. The only sound was the wind whistling through the bracing wires of the wings. By the time the German soldiers heard this sound, it was too late. The bombs were already falling. After dropping their payload, the pilots would restart their engines and scramble away before the anti-aircraft guns could lock onto them. This tactic of silent gliding was incredibly effective, but also incredibly dangerous. If the engine failed to restart, the pilot would be forced to crash land behind enemy lines. The psychological impact on the German troops was devastating. They could never rest knowing that the night witches were prowling above. The constant harassment disrupted supply lines and lowered morale. The German high command began to take the threat seriously. Rumors spread among the German ranks that these women were criminals forced to fly, or that they had been given special injections to see in the dark. The effectiveness of the night witches was so great that the German military offered a prestigious reward for shooting one down. Any German pilot who managed to destroy a Po-2 was automatically awarded the Iron Cross. This incentive showed just how much of a nuisance the wooden biplanes had become. However, shooting them down was harder than it looked. The Po-2 flew so low to the ground that German fighters could not dive on them without risking a crash. The women used the terrain to their advantage, hiding behind tree lines and hills to evade pursuit. The greatest enemy for the night witches was often the weather itself. Flying in open cockpits during the harsh Russian winter was a torture of its own. Temperatures would drop to 40 degrees below zero, freezing the wind on their faces. The pilots risked severe frostbite on every mission. They had to wrap themselves in layers of newspaper beneath their flight suits to retain body heat. Touching the metal parts of the plane with bare skin would tear the flesh away. Despite these agonizing conditions, the women continued to fly, proving their incredible physical and mental endurance. The ground crews worked just as hard as the pilots. The mechanics were also women, and they had to service the planes in freezing conditions, often working with bare hands. They loaded the heavy bombs, manually lifting them up to the wing racks. Because the Po-2 could only carry a small load, the pilots had to fly multiple missions in a single night. They would return to base, drop their bombs, refuel, reload, and take off again. Some crews flew as many as 10 or 15 sorties in a single night. The turnaround time was crucial, and the mechanics worked with lightning speed. One of the most celebrated pilots of the regiment was Nadezhda Popova. She was a young woman who had dreamed of being a pilot since she was a teenager. Popova flew hundreds of missions and became known for her aggressive flying style. On one occasion, she returned to base with 42 bullet holes in her plane and her helmet and map case pierced by shrapnel. She survived the war and later recounted the terror and adrenaline of those night raids. Her story is a testament to the courage that defined the entire regiment. The danger of fire was a constant companion for the night witches. The canvas of the Po-2 was coated in a chemical dope to make it stiff and waterproof, but this also made it extremely flammable. If a plane was hit by an incendiary bullet, it would burn like a torch. For the first few years of the war, the pilots were not issued parachutes. The command believed that the extra weight would limit the bomb load, and that parachutes might encourage pilots to bail out too early. This meant that if their plane caught fire, the women had no escape. The lack of parachutes meant that the pilots carried pistols with them in the cockpit. If they were shot down and survived the crash, they were prepared to take their own lives rather than be captured by the Germans. They knew that the Nazis treated captured female partisans and soldiers with extreme brutality. The last bullet was always saved for themselves. It was a grim reality that every woman in the regiment accepted. They flew with the knowledge that death could be instant and fiery, or slow and painful on the ground. As the war progressed, the Germans developed new tactics to counter the night witches. They set up flak circuses, which were concentric rings of anti-aircraft guns combined with powerful searchlights. If a pilot was caught in the beam of a searchlight, she was blinded and became an easy target for the guns. The women learned to fly in pairs to counter this. One plane would draw the fire and the searchlights acting as a decoy, while the other slipped in to drop the bombs. It was a game of cat and mouse played with high explosives. Tragedy struck the regiment many times. One terrible night saw the loss of 4 planes and 8 women in quick succession. They were caught in a wall of searchlights and torn apart by flak. The survivors at the base watched in horror as their friends burned in the sky. The next morning there were empty bunks in the barracks. Yet the regiment did not stop flying. They turned their grief into fury. They painted slogans on the sides of their planes, dedicating their bombs to their fallen sisters. Despite the horror of their nightly work, the women tried to maintain a sense of normalcy at the base. They decorated their barracks with wild flowers and used navigation pencils as lip liner. They embroidered patterns on their foot wraps and sang songs during the brief moments of rest. This preservation of their femininity was an act of defiance. They refused to let the war strip away their humanity. They were soldiers and killers in the sky, but on the ground they remained women who dreamed of peace and love. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment followed the front lines as the Red Army pushed the Germans back. They flew missions over the Caucasus, over the Crimea, and eventually over Poland and Germany itself. They participated in the final assault on Berlin, raining bombs down on the crumbling capital of the Third Reich. By the end of the war, the regiment had flown over 23,000 sorties and dropped 3,000 tons of bombs. It was an incredible achievement for a unit that had been dismissed as a joke just a few years earlier. 23 pilots of the regiment were awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest honor in the nation. Yevdokia Bershinskaya became the only woman to receive the Order of Suvorov. However, their recognition was not always guaranteed. When the victory parade was held in Moscow, the Night Witches were not included. Their planes were considered too slow and obsolete for the grand display of military might. It was a bitter pill to swallow after so much sacrifice. After the war, the regiment was disbanded. The women who had terrorized the Luftwaffe were told to return to civilian life. Many of them struggled to adjust. They had lived with high adrenaline and constant danger for 4 years. Now they were expected to become wives and mothers as if nothing had happened. Yet they never forgot their service. They held reunions every year, meeting in Moscow to remember the friends they had lost. They kept the memory of the Night Witches alive through their stories and their bond. The legacy of the Night Witches is one of unparalleled bravery and resilience. They proved that courage has no gender and that determination can overcome superior technology. They flew wooden biplanes against the most advanced air force in the world, and they won. Their story challenges the traditional narratives of war, which often focus solely on the deeds of men. These women were not just supporting the war effort, they were the tip of the spear in the darkness. Today, the legend of the 588th continues to inspire. Historians and aviation enthusiasts marvel at what these women accomplished in their fragile aircraft. Monuments stand in their honor, and books have been written about their exploits. They taught the world that the spirit of a warrior is defined by heart and skill, not by physical strength or equipment. The whistling sound of a gliding Po-2 remains a ghostly echo in the annals of military history, a reminder of the night the witches flew. As we look back on the history of World War II, it is vital to remember the shadows as well as the spotlight. The Night Witches operated in the dark, unseen by the newsreels that captured the tank battles and the infantry charges. But their contribution was undeniable. They denied the enemy sleep, destroyed their supplies, and broke their morale. In the cold skies over the Eastern Front, they carved their names into history. They were the Night Witches, and they owned the darkness.